Oh, sorry. I couldn't see it very well. Well, we have plenty of time, so you can just try again.
My husband said this, mocking me and our daughter, never seeing us as more than convenient tools. But evil never prospers in this world. Because of that attitude, my husband was punished.
I can't go on living anymore.
However, to be honest, I'm not satisfied. I don't intend to let divine punishment be the end of it. It doesn't really matter what happens. He's going to face the consequences for treating us like we didn't matter. My name is Catherine Tomlinson, 33 years old. Once upon a time, after going through some unusual circumstances, I became an office worker. Now I'm married after accepting a proposal, quit my job, and became a full-time housewife. Currently, I'm a mother of one, managing the household and taking care of the family. But back in the day, I wasn't comfortable around men. To be precise, I used to be fine, so it's more accurate to say that I developed that discomfort. It was due to some experiences I had with men before I started working. That's why I believed I'd never get married. But living without ever interacting with men is impossible. Honestly, I wanted to quit and find a job in an all-women's workplace. But being naive and without much education, I had no choice but to work somewhere through a connection. And the one who became my mentor was my current husband, Greg. I still remember the kind words he said to me, fully aware of my situation.
I won't force you, but your experience can be a powerful tool to help someone. I hope you can lend it to others who are struggling in the same way.
I was deeply moved by those words, and under Greg's guidance, I learned the job and did my best to support the women I encountered in the workplace, just like he said. As I spent more time with him, I gradually found myself attracted to Greg, not just for his kindness, but for his dedication to his work. It seemed that Greg felt something for me as well, and he eventually confessed his feelings. We started dating, and before I knew it, we were married. Not long after that, our daughter, Emily, was born, and back then, I was undoubtedly happy. But somewhere along the line, our happiness started to fade. I just hadn't realized it at the time. It became clear to me when Emily turned 3. Back then, Greg became increasingly busy with a new project, and he was often away from home. I did everything I could to support him, throwing myself into housework, childcare, and anything else I could do to help. I would text him, asking if he had any meal requests or if there was anything he needed. I always made sure his suits were perfectly cleaned and ready, considering how much time he spent out of the office. I wasn't about to claim I was the perfect wife, but I certainly tried my hardest to be one. But for some reason, the more I did, the more Greg seemed to drift away from me.
You're so annoying. Seriously, every meal you make is the same.
I had made all sorts of different dishes for him, so I didn't think that was true. But I figured his job must be really stressful, so I chose to keep my thoughts to myself. Maybe Greg took advantage of my silence, because his attitude toward me gradually became more and more overbearing. If it had just been directed at me, I probably would have continued to be the good wife in silence. But Greg's behavior started to affect Emily as well. One day, while Emily was playing with blocks in the living room, Greg came home early. He went out of his way to bump into the blocks, knocking over the cute little house she had built, and said in a flat, emotionless voice,
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Well, there's plenty of time, so you can just make it again.
"Hey, that's not the way to talk. Help her rebuild it." Greg used to dote on Emily. But as if all of that had been a dream, Greg became indifferent to parenting. On top of that, he started acting as if Emily was a burden, repeating actions that made it seem like he found her an annoyance. I didn't care about myself. If it was just work stress, I could understand and tolerate it. But a child can't possibly know why they're being scolded or treated coldly. So every time it happened, I'd ask Greg to be kinder to Emily. But his response was always the same.
Stop nagging. I've left everything about Emily to you. It's your job to keep her happy.
When did that happen? We were supposed to raise our child together as a couple. My thoughts didn't reach him, though. He just threw out his selfish excuses and went back to his own time. As time went on, my suspicions toward Greg grew. And in proportion, the affection he once showed me and Emily began to fade. The more I thought about it, the less I could overlook his actions, which I used to let slide. He often came home late from work, sometimes even staying out until morning, and it seemed to happen more frequently than it should. Even on his rare days off, he would leave, saying he had been called into work, yet our household income didn't reflect the supposed extra work he was doing. Then there was the perfume. Greg would come home smelling of it. "It's part of the job, you know that, right?" he'd say, but it didn't sit well with me. There were only a few places his office would go to for those kinds of business meetings. Some of those places were closed on the days he came home smelling like that. Of course, it was possible he'd gone somewhere else for a client's sake. But even with that in mind, my doubts couldn't be erased. In the end, I began to believe that Greg's so-called work was a lie and that he was just out having fun. If that was all, I might have been able to let it go. But what concerned me was whether he was crossing a line that would make him unfit as a husband and father. Once I started thinking that way, I began to quietly investigate Greg, all while pretending to be the same obedient, clueless wife on the surface.
Catherine, you're finally starting to get it, aren't you? Make sure you teach Emily properly, too.
After a while, Greg's attitude softened slightly. In the end, what Greg really wanted was a wife and family that existed solely for his convenience. People who saw only what he wanted them to see and acted according to his wishes. Once that became clear to me, my love for him started to fade. Meanwhile, Greg, under the impression that we had become completely obedient, began to act more recklessly. He stopped making excuses for coming home late or staying out all night. On weekends, he would leave us behind, ignoring even the bare minimum of family time. Even Emily was clearly fed up with it. Emily, who used to look forward to going out and spending time with Greg, eventually stopped asking for those things altogether. "Do you want to visit Grandma and Grandpa's place?"
Yeah.
I felt guilty, so our visits to my parents' house became more frequent. Emily, however, was always thrilled to see her kind grandparents, and Greg didn't even notice our absence. Just before Emily started elementary school, I finally understood. As a family, we had already broken down long ago. To be more precise, Greg's absence from our family was glaring. After realizing this, I began to quietly prepare. Greg's presence was becoming a negative influence on Emily. I needed to make plans to protect her well-being. One day, while I was thinking about these things, an important celebration came up. For that occasion, my parents, Emily, Greg, and I were supposed to go out together. I intentionally didn't tell Greg exactly what we were celebrating. I figured he should be able to understand something this simple, and I placed my last bit of hope on it. So make sure to keep that day free.
Yeah, if I remember, I will.
I reminded him a month before, then a week before, repeatedly emphasizing the importance of the day. But Greg just brushed it off like always. As usual, he brushed it off casually. With this, I knew I couldn't expect much from him on the actual day. Just as I expected, Greg said he had plans with friends and went out somewhere. At that point, I didn't feel anything about his behavior anymore. Honestly, I thought I'd be more disappointed, but I wasn't. Even Emily didn't seem to care. After saying, "Oh, okay," she never mentioned Greg again. So, without Greg, the rest of us went out. Our destination was an amusement park, a place Emily had wanted to visit for a long time. My parents, Emily, and I had an amazing time there. Emily's eyes sparkled during one of the events, and her face lit up with the biggest smile. With that smile, I knew for certain that we would be just fine. That happiness was more than enough. But then, a call came that ruined everything. The only fortunate part was that it came just as we had finished our time with Emily and were about to head home.
Is this Catherine Tomlinson?
It was from an unknown number that had been calling me repeatedly. I had ignored it for a while, but my curiosity finally got the better of me, so I answered. What the man on the other end said was completely unexpected. Greg had been in a car accident. His car had plunged into a small creek along a city road, and he was in critical condition. Thankfully, no pedestrians or other vehicles had been involved. Despite my mixed emotions, I told the man I would head to the hospital immediately and hung up the phone. Emily and my parents, who had just left the amusement park with me, looked at me with concern as I suddenly grew serious. I entrusted Emily to my mother and took a moment to explain the situation to my father. Though even I didn't fully understand the details yet. What was certain, however, was that I needed to head to the hospital right away. But I didn't want to upset Emily today. With that in mind, I decided to leave her in the care of my parents for the time being. Sweetheart, Mommy has to go out for something important, but can you stay here with Grandpa and Grandma? Emily looked a little sad for a moment, but then she quickly smiled and nodded.
Yeah, I can. So go do your best, Mommy.
Her encouragement filled me with energy. I nodded firmly, waved goodbye, and left. We had taken the bus to the amusement park, but waiting for it would take too long. So I called a taxi to take me home. After quickly stopping by the house to grab my car, I drove to the hospital. When I arrived, Greg was still in surgery. The red light above the operating room door was on, and all I could do was wait. During that time, a nurse provided me with more details about the accident. Amid all of this, there was one detail that particularly caught my attention. It seemed that there was another passenger in Greg's car at the time of the accident, a young woman. Her name was Sarah Mitchell. She was also seriously injured and undergoing surgery. I knew who she was, but mentioning this now would likely only confuse Greg's parents. So, I kept quiet and didn't ask any further questions, simply waiting in the hospital's waiting room. Not long after, Greg's parents, having been contacted by me, arrived at the hospital. We all sat there with somber expressions, waiting. During this time, the sound of a woman crying, nearly screaming, came from the waiting room next door. Clearly, someone else's loved one was in surgery too. As I silently prayed for the safety of both, Greg's surgery finally ended. Fortunately, Greg's life was no longer in danger. His parents thanked the surgeon with relief visible on their faces, clearly grateful for the outcome. Just as the heavy tension between us had started to ease a little, a couple we didn't know entered the waiting room without any notice. They appeared to be middle-aged, likely a bit younger than Greg's parents or my own.
How could this happen?
Greg's mother looked confused, startled by this sudden outburst. But the middle-aged woman paid no attention to her confusion and, with a fierce expression, raised her voice further.
Our daughter got caught up in an accident because of someone from your family. Just this morning, she was happy and excited, smiling because she was going out with friends. How could this happen to our daughter? She was so sweet, with such a bright future ahead of her. How could this happen?
The woman directed her anger solely at us. Her husband, the middle-aged man beside her, tried to calm her down, but it was clear her fury wasn't going to subside easily. It seemed they were the parents of Sarah, the young woman who had been in the accident with Greg. We still didn't have accurate details about the accident. After all, the people involved were still unable to speak about what happened. We couldn't argue or say anything in response, so Greg's parents and I were left bewildered, simply enduring the woman's fury. But I couldn't entirely blame Sarah's mother. Her daughter had suddenly been involved in a serious accident and was now in surgery. If the person to blame wasn't there, it wasn't surprising that her anger would be directed at the family instead. What broke the tense atmosphere was a nurse who came to call us. Without responding, we left the waiting room and handled various procedures and notifications. Afterward, I went home to gather the things Greg would need while hospitalized. This would likely be the last thing I could do for Greg as his wife. Feeling a bit sentimental, I packed everything Greg and I needed and headed back to the hospital. On the way, I called my parents to let them know it would take a bit longer. Apparently, Emily had fallen asleep while waiting for me, which made me feel guilty. I wanted to get everything wrapped up quickly for my sweet daughter's sake. With that thought, I made my way back to the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, Greg had been moved to a room and had just regained consciousness. His parents, relieved that he was okay, asked him about the situation, but his responses were vague and unclear. Amid all this, Greg finally asked about the one thing that had clearly been weighing on his mind.
Do you know what happened to the woman who was with me?
I relayed what the doctor had told me within the limits of what I knew. The young woman who had been in the car with him had been thrown from the vehicle during the crash, sustaining severe injuries, especially to her face. Although the surgery was successful and her life was no longer in danger, her body would recover with rehabilitation, but her face had been left in a terrible state. The moment Greg heard this, his face turned pale, and he buried his head in his hands.
Oh no, it's over. I can't live anymore. There's no place left for me.
For a brief moment, he might have appeared as a man genuinely remorseful for the consequences of his actions. But from my perspective, someone who had more or less pieced together the situation, I could see that it was a selfish and repulsive statement. While his parents felt anguish watching him suffer, I quietly thought to myself, whatever happens, happens. Honestly, I wanted to get my own issues out in the open quickly, but the right moment just hadn't come. In the middle of all this, 2 police officers entered the room. They explained that they were investigating the accident and had been unable to interview Greg earlier due to his unconscious state. They wanted him to provide details that the investigation hadn't been able to uncover. You must have realized that there was no way to deceive the police. Or perhaps it was the explanation that giving false information could lead to legal trouble that made him cooperate. Greg, who had been vague when speaking to his parents, now began to cautiously explain the situation from that day. According to Greg, the passenger in the car was a popular celebrity who worked for the entertainment agency he was employed by. While driving for work-related matters, he saw her, Sarah Mitchell. Greg and Sarah had previously worked together on a project, him in management and her as the stage performer, but they no longer had a direct working relationship. However, since they still worked for the same agency, when Greg heard that Sarah was also heading to the office, he decided to give her a ride. It was during this ride that the accident happened. Apparently, during the drive, his wedding ring, which had been resting on the dashboard, rolled off and fell to the floor. When Greg reached down to retrieve it, he accidentally pressed the accelerator too hard, causing the car to speed up uncontrollably. The vehicle veered off the city road onto the edge and plunged into the river. After that, he completely lost consciousness and only woke up in the hospital. After finishing his account, Greg asked the officers about Sarah's condition. But their response didn't differ much from what we had already been told. They carefully reiterated the extent of Sarah's facial injuries and explained that she would likely have permanent scars. Perhaps out of consideration for Greg's growing distress, the officers soon left.
I've done something absolutely terrible.
He had asked the police again, likely because he didn't want to believe what had happened. But that only forced him to confront the harsh reality. His hands trembled, likely out of fear and anxiety, and I gently took one of them in mine. It'll be okay. The insurance should cover the compensation and medical expenses.
That might be true, but what am I supposed to do now? I've done something that can't be undone to anyone involved.
Sarah's life, both as a celebrity and as a woman, would undoubtedly be altered forever. Her family would harbor deep resentment and hatred toward Greg for what happened. The fans she had, apparently quite a large number, would also be filled with anger. And the thing Greg feared the most would likely happen too.
What am I supposed to do?
Greg's voice trembled on the verge of breaking into sobs. I embraced him, gently rubbing his back, trying to calm him down. It's okay, Greg. I'll stay with you.
Catherine, thank you so much.
He whispered, tears streaming down his face as he hugged me back. A few days later, when Sarah's condition had stabilized, Greg and his parents expressed a desire to meet her. They feared her parents might refuse, but to their surprise, they were allowed to visit. Supporting Greg as he hobbled on crutches, I accompanied him and his parents to Sarah's hospital room. In the hospital room, lying on the bed was a woman with her face almost entirely covered in bandages, except for her mouth and eyes. It was unmistakably Sarah. Her body was also wrapped in bandages, far more injured than any of us had imagined. The sight left Greg and his parents speechless.
This is your fault.
Standing by Sarah's side were her parents, the same couple who had angrily confronted us days earlier. Their expressions were filled with such anger that even the slightest touch might have set them off. Since Sarah, due to her facial injuries, couldn't speak properly yet, her parents expressed their fury on her behalf.
How do you plan to take responsibility for this?
Faced with their searing anger, Greg's parents finally found their voices again and began apologizing profusely. Greg, too, hurriedly repeated his apologies over and over. But even after listening to their words, it was clear that Sarah's parents had no intention of forgiving them.
We thought maybe hearing your apologies would change something, but we cannot forgive the people who have taken away our daughter's bright future.
Exactly. You will fully compensate for the life our daughter has lost and the money she was supposed to earn in the years to come.
Yes, of course, we will pay. We'll pay the full amount.
Greg glanced at me for a brief moment before he said this, and right after, Sarah and her parents exchanged looks and nodded in agreement. The next moment, their demand left us all wide-eyed.
Then, $1 million. You will pay us $1 million.
What? That's far too much. I mean, the insurance company should also cover the compensation.
Greg muttered without thinking, which only reignited Sarah's parents' fury.
Too much. How can you say that after ruining someone's entire life?
You haven't learned anything, have you? That's why you think the money from the insurance company is enough.
As the couple continued to shout, Sarah, lying on the bed, also clenched her fists tightly. As if to give form to Sarah's unspoken feelings, her father grabbed Greg by the collar and shook him violently.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
His parents, thinking this was a justified reaction, stood by silently, unable to intervene, simply watching as Greg was shaken. But to me, Greg's pathetic display was nothing more than ridiculous, almost laughable. Sure, I felt a bit sorry for Sarah and her family. But to be honest, I didn't feel nearly as much sympathy or guilt as Greg's parents did.
Hey, what's with you, standing there with that detached look on your face?
The middle-aged woman finally seemed to notice me, her voice rising with anger as she addressed me.
Aren't you that man's wife? Shouldn't you be apologizing right alongside him?
I think you're absolutely right. But that would only be appropriate if your daughter and, for now, my husband, Greg, had a healthy relationship.
Ha.
Sarah's mother stared at me, utterly confused by what I was implying. I think the misfortune that's happened here is unfortunate, and I feel bad for it. But more than that, I'm angry.
What? Catherine, what are you talking about?
Greg stammered as both he and his parents looked bewildered at my sudden outburst, seemingly unrelated to the current situation. But I wasn't about to stop now. I had decided that it was time to say what needed to be said, to finally lay everything out in the open. Because Greg and your daughter, Sarah, are having an affair. To me, she is nothing more than my husband's mistress.
What?
At my accusation, Greg let out a loud gasp, and Sarah visibly flinched on the bed. I had begun to suspect Greg's unfaithfulness as his late returns home became more frequent, coinciding with the time I had started to lose patience with his dishonesty. Luckily, I had plenty of savings from my younger years. I used that money to hire a private investigator to look into Greg's possible affair. The results were undeniable. Completely black and white. The other person involved, none other than Sarah Mitchell, the woman now lying in that hospital bed. The investigators' photos showed the two of them clearly entering and exiting a motel together. There were also pictures of them kissing, being affectionate, and going on dates. The fact that they were together in the car during the accident was hardly a first. They had gone out countless times. Over the course of the investigation, an overwhelming amount of evidence piled up, so much so that I found myself wondering how they never got bored of it. Another piece of evidence I have is the exchange between Greg and Sarah that I managed to retrieve from his phone when I had a chance. It seems Greg planned to divorce me and then marry Sarah. His cold behavior toward me and Emily was likely part of his preparation for the eventual divorce. He didn't want to be the one to initiate the divorce, as it would hurt his image and might result in him being forced to pay alimony. So, he treated us poorly, hoping I would be the one to suggest the separation. Given how eager he was to remarry, he probably also found us an inconvenience. Sarah, too, seemed on board with the plan, but the timing wasn't right just yet. After all, Sarah is a popular celebrity at the agency where Greg works. If they made the wrong move, it could ruin her market value as a celebrity. That's why they kept their relationship secret and met in secret over and over again. On the day of the accident, Greg told me he had plans with friends, but he told the police he was going out for work-related matters. At this point, it's clear he was lying and trying to hide something. To be sure, I looked into Greg's circle of friends to see if anyone had actually planned to meet with him that day. But unsurprisingly, no one in his contacts had mentioned any such plans. I had suspected this all along, so it came as no surprise.
Wait, hold on. You have no proof that I said anything about meeting friends. You must be misunderstanding something.
Sorry, but that's not the case. I said as I pulled out my phone and played back a recording of our conversation from that day. I had a reason for wanting to make sure I had solid proof of that conversation on that day. I wanted to get a clear statement from Greg. So, I made sure to record it on my phone, though I never imagined it would come in handy like this. Greg clearly hadn't expected me to have recorded him. He was speechless, stunned by the revelation. Honestly, Greg had been careless. He'd underestimated me, assuming I was too foolish to notice, and gave a flimsy excuse. If he'd at least kept his lies consistent, he might have been able to maintain his cover here. But now, with all the evidence piling up, he had no way out. Well, as you can see, Greg was lying. And if I remember correctly, Sarah also mentioned she was going out with friends that day, didn't she? I recalled Sarah's mother saying this in the hospital waiting room after the accident. This raised yet another inconsistency. Had Sarah's parents been aware of this lie, or had they been in the dark as well? Sarah's parents looked stunned, their faces betraying their shock. They both lied and were in the car together. If that doesn't make you question an affair, then what would?
Well, Catherine, calm down. Isn't this a bit off topic right now?
Greg blurted out, clearly wanting to change the subject. It was obvious that Greg was the one who wasn't being rational. What I was discussing now was the most important issue. This was the root cause, the very reason we were all here in the first place. What are you talking about? This is exactly the heart of the matter, isn't it? I turned to look directly at Sarah, who was sitting up in the bed. Though her face was hidden beneath the bandages, her slight movements as she tried to shift away from me revealed enough about her feelings. It was clear she wanted to distance herself, both physically and emotionally. I directed my words toward Greg and Sarah, both clearly terrified of the truth being exposed or called out. The fact is, none of this would have happened if the two of you weren't involved with each other.
Og.
Greg let out a foolish sound, unable to contain himself, but I continued without paying him any mind. Tell me, why did you do this? Your parents said you had such a bright future ahead of you, didn't they? Greg and Sarah's affair likely began during the time they were working on a project together. What Sarah found appealing about Greg, I had no idea. Perhaps he whispered the same comforting words to her that he once said to me. But still, right is right and wrong is wrong. Cheating is something that goes against basic decency. And for a celebrity, someone who inspires and gives hope to others, it's even worse. At the very least, Sarah had managed to hide this part of her life from her fans. Something I was never able to do. She had a natural talent that made her a successful performer. And that's why, if she had focused solely on her career, things could have turned out so differently. That thought brought a touch of sadness.
What exactly are you trying to say?
Sarah's mother shouted, her voice filled with confusion, likely because the situation was spiraling out of the control she expected. I want both Greg and Sarah to face consequences equally. That's how I feel. I nodded slightly, then restated my point. You claim that only Greg is at fault and should take responsibility, but that's a mistake.
Why is that?
Have you ever heard of the term voluntary passenger? Voluntary passenger refers to someone who willingly rides in another person's car without compensation. In cases where this is recognized, the driver's responsibility toward the passenger in the event of an accident is reduced. Sarah voluntarily got into Greg's car, meaning it was her choice. And based on the circumstances of the accident, I don't think Greg acted completely recklessly either. Greg's story to the police about reaching for his wedding ring didn't seem like a lie. If that were the case, then Sarah should have warned him that trying to pick up the ring while driving was dangerous. As a passenger, Sarah had a duty to assist the driver, and she failed to fulfill that role. It's hard to say she holds no responsibility for the accident. That's why I believe you have no grounds to demand such an outrageous amount like $1 million. In fact, I'll be filing a compensation claim against Sarah for damages myself.
What? A reduction in the amount, plus compensation.
Sarah's parents looked shocked at my assertion. It made me wonder if they had been trying to use the accident to squeeze more money out of Greg than was necessary. I couldn't be sure, but their reactions and words seemed suspicious. Maybe even Sarah herself was aware of this plan?
Yes, I admit I'm at fault, but Sarah also bears some responsibility.
Greg chimed in, seemingly seeing an opportunity to reduce the compensation. While he had appeared somewhat remorseful earlier, his true nature was starting to show again. It was honestly just exhausting to witness. Greg, you seem to be enjoying yourself, but let me be clear, you have neither the right nor the room to be saying such things. I said, glaring at him. This wasn't just a warning, it was the final blow.
What do you mean?
For years, you've been cheating and neglecting this family. I have no intention of staying married to you any longer. I'm divorcing you. I declared, handing Greg some of the evidence I had brought, just in case I might need it. His face turned pale once again as he looked at the proof.
Wait, please. If we divorce now, I'll be in trouble.
That's because you're after my money, isn't it?
Og.
Greg was left speechless. I had once been a celebrity. To be honest, I was quite successful, and the money I made back then still remains untouched for the most part. But that success came with a price. Some male fans who didn't respect boundaries drove me to emotional distress, which led to my fear of men. I eventually resigned from my profession and took on a regular position as an employee at the agency where I used to work. Greg was the one who helped me heal during that time. He knew my past, of course. Yet, he pretended not to, treated me like any other employee, and helped me grow within the company. The fact that Greg was now relying on my money was nothing more than proof of how much he had changed.
But, I'm your husband in a crisis. Isn't it only natural for you to help me?
He shamelessly blurted out, without any sign of embarrassment. Seeing him like this, so utterly pathetic, I felt a deep sense of emptiness and let out a heavy sigh. All I've heard from you since the accident is I can't live, my place, me. It's always been about you, hasn't it?
Huh?
And the reason you're worried about Sarah is because you're terrified the company will hold you responsible for ruining the future of one of their top celebrities, isn't it? It had always been like that. Greg never truly cared about the people around him. Not about his concerned parents who rushed to his side, not about me, nor about Sarah or her family, whom he had dragged into this mess. He pretended to care, but it was all just a front to protect himself and maintain his image. All of it, just an act. I can't continue being a family with someone who only thinks about himself. You don't even care about your own daughter, so why should I care about you?
No, that's not true. Let's live together again. Just the three of us, you, me, and Emily. We can be happy.
Oh, really? Then tell me, do you remember what day it was for us when the accident happened? Greg's eyes darted around nervously before he smiled with a hint of confidence.
Our wedding anniversary, right?
It was Emily's birthday.
What?
His clueless response left me utterly exhausted. I couldn't even look at him with anything other than pure disgust. But at least now Greg had to understand that there was no going back. The idea of repairing our family was beyond impossible. You don't even remember your own daughter's birthday, and you call this a family. It's not even funny.
No, that's not it. It was a joke. I'm sorry. You said let's stay together. Forever.
I never said forever, did I? Besides, at that time, I was just waiting for the right moment to leave. No longer finding any value in Greg's words. In fact, I didn't even want to breathe the same air as him anymore. I glanced at Greg's parents before turning to leave, heading for the door. The rest of you can handle this matter. I'll be in touch about the compensation later. Oh, and Greg, we'll go over the divorce papers when you're ready.
Wait. Catherine, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please, come back.
Greg called out, panicking as he tried to follow me out the door. But before he could, the hospital room door closed behind me, preventing him from doing so. It was likely his parents who stepped in and closed the door. The last look they gave me was one of deep regret and apology. As the door shut, I caught one final glimpse of Greg's face, twisted in an ugly expression of desperation. That was the last image I ever had of him. From that moment on, I left everything in the hands of the lawyer I had hired. Greg, stubborn as ever, continued to resist, but his parents eventually scolded him for his disgraceful behavior. In the end, through tears, he finally accepted everything. Thus, Greg and I officially divorced. As a result, Greg was left with a significant debt, including both the alimony he owed me and the compensation for Sarah. Despite this, he had almost no savings left, having squandered most of it while fooling around with Sarah. On top of that, Greg was fired from his job, held responsible for the accident. Currently, Greg works day and night just to scrape by. But even that wasn't the end of his punishment. Apparently, Sarah's fans have been harassing him both online and in real life, forcing him to live in constant fear, running from place to place. Socially, Greg has practically vanished from existence. He occasionally sends me messages about wanting to start over, but needless to say, I ignore every single one. Sarah, of course, was also fired from her role as a performer. However, it wasn't just because of the facial injuries from the accident. It was primarily due to her relationship with Greg. Since Greg had been favoring her in the agency, her dismissal served as a warning, ensuring no such preferential treatment would happen again in the future. Sarah is still living with her parents, unable to remove the bandages from her face and struggling to recover physically and mentally. Her parents have temporarily covered the compensation I demanded from her. While I've received the money and have no intention of pursuing anything further, I can only hope that both she and her parents turn things around and live more responsibly from here on. As for me and Emily, we're currently living with my parents. Emily never mentions Greg anymore. She spends her days happily playing with my parents and the new friends she's made since we moved. I'm relieved that Emily doesn't seem to be affected or dwelling on Greg's absence. That's what matters most to me. I've already shortlisted a few new jobs and will be focusing on interviews for the time being. Right now, my only goal is to do everything I can for Emily's sake. While I know challenges may lie ahead, I believe I can overcome them all as long as I have Emily's smile to keep me going.